Hi. Thank you for attending today's reading. Let's begin. How I accidentally ate another person's popcorn in the theater. Story happened a few years ago, so details might be fuzzy. So I was watching a movie with my family in the theaters. We were enjoying the movies, and usually we grab each other's popcorn and share from the same bowl. I'm sure you can see where this is headed. So naturally I stuck my hand out to the left and I grabbed my popcorn, and it tasted like ketchup. And I thought that it tasted weird, so I grab another piece and I was like, WTF is this? So I turn to see a girl staring at me. And I was like, Then she said, do you want some? So I was like, no, you can have it. It's your popcorn. And also cause it was covered in ketchup, but I didn't want to be rude to her. So then I began to wonder where my family was, and they were on the other side. I told them, I thought you were on my side, and they said no, and that they were on this side all along. And that's basically how I ate someone else's popcorn. End of story. Next story. Once upon a time there was a man who asked a woman to marry him. She said, no, and he lived happily ever after. The end. End of story. Next story. This idiot from my middle school. So there was this idiot who was always convinced he was adopted. And he would say other dumb stuff. One day he found evidence that he was adopted and that his birth mom lived in Cleveland, Ohio. So, one day, he skips school, takes his dad's kayak, and tries to row upstream to Cleveland. This boy trained to row upstream on a pretty strong river. I learned all of this the day after he ran by one of my friends, who we'll call by his name in Spanish class, Furious Jorge, on a Discord call. When I first got on the call, he was dying with laughter about how dumb the runaway was. FJ. Brew. You won't believe this. Me. What is it? Furious Jorge? FJ. A kid tried to row upstream to Cleveland. Me. WTF. I started laughing. Apparently, he was stopped in the next county over, after he accidentally beached his kayak. End of story. Next story. Money can free someone from death row. I'm a washed-up lawyer who was hired by a wealthy drug smuggling family to not only get their son off of death row but also out of prison. My client's son, Richard, had killed his neighbor's wife and their 2 kids. He had also critically injured the husband. I was given $3 million in expenses, and I would get $5 million if I was able to get him ultimately out of prison. If I was unsuccessful, then my client would probably kill me. I was tired of defending people who I knew were guilty, and even if I got him an innocent verdict, they still wouldn't pay me. I figured if I lost this case I would just flee to somewhere in South America or Europe. Basically, the awards outweighed the risks. I came up with a plan. First, I needed to find someone who was willing to assert the neighbor husband as the murderer. Then, I needed the Supreme Court to overturn the original verdict, based on the new evidence. The original guilty verdict was based on a long-standing neighborly feud that Richard had with his neighbor Kevin. The jury believed that Richard broke into the neighbor's house and shot each of the 4 victims. The gun was later found in Richard's house. I needed one of Kevin's close friends or a family member to lie and say the gun was planted in Richard's house by Kevin. I researched Kevin's family and friends and discovered he had 2 older brothers. I only had one chance at this, and if one of the brothers declined my offer, then it was over, because that brother would then tell the court that I had approached him with a heinous offer. I learned that both brothers were married with children. As I dug deeper, I learned one of the brothers was having an affair. This brother's name was George. I needed to first gather evidence on George and his outer marriage affair. Then offer him a large amount of money to lie and frame his brother Kevin. I paid a private detective $50,000 to surveillance George and to come up with a ton of evidence that he was having an affair on his wife. George worked on Wall Street as a broker. I waited a month for my hired private detective to come up with photos and text messages of the affair, which I finally received. With the evidence in hand, I handed it to George as he was leaving work with a message to call me. The next day he called me and I told him to meet me the following day in Central Park to discuss his options. I met him in a secluded area in Central Park. He was extremely mad and told me his sob story of how his wife would divorce him if she found out. I asked him, "What are your concerns with getting a divorce?" Quote. He replied, "It's none of your goddamn business." Quote. I told him, "If you tell me then perhaps I can help you." He said, "I don't need your fucking help." I then said, "Is it the money or how the kids would be affected from the divorce?" Quote. He then said, "Once again it's none of your fucking business." And then he started to walk away. I then said, "Would $2 million in cash be helpful?" Quote. He turned around and said, "What?" Quote. I said it again, "Would $2 million in cash be helpful?" Quote. He replied, "Who do I have to kill?" Quote. I said, "No one, but I'll need you to testify against someone." He responded, "Testify against who?" "I don't know anything." I said, "I know you don't. But would you be willing to do what I tell you to do and say what I tell you to say in exchange for the money?" Quote. He responded, "Keep talking." I said, "First I need you to agree to testify for me." He replied, "Whatever, as long as I don't have kill anyone." I said, "It doesn't, but you'll need to testify against your brother Kevin." He said, "Kevin's been through hell. He came close to death and his family was murdered." I replied, "Yay. Now I need you to testify that he told you that he was going to frame his neighbor and that he planted the gun in Richard's house." He responded, "Who would sit idle if someone told you that they were going to kill their own kids?" Quote. I replied, "You need to say that Kevin's original plan was just to kill his own wife who he thought was having an affair. You tell the court that you would have done more if you knew the kids were going to be harmed." He replied, "Won't they throw me in jail for lying?" Quote. I said, "Kevin was never a suspect and you never testified. So as long as you don't change your story after being sworn in as a witness, then you'll be fine." He said, "Well, what about Kevin?" Quote. I said, "Truthfully, I really don't care about Kevin. Perhaps the courts wouldn't go forward with prosecuting him. I really don't know. I only care about getting my client's family member out of prison." He said, "What if I don't do this?" Quote. I replied, "Then all of the evidence I have I will give to your wife and you'll go broke paying childcare and alimony on top of court and lawyer fees." He said, "You have to be one of the biggest degenerates in the world." I said, "That might be true, but I'm not the one living a double life, and if you really wanted to, you could give some of the money to Kevin to justify your decision." He said, "What's the next step?" Quote. I replied, "I need you to give me a signed sworn statement. Then I need you to appear in court for my client Richard's appeal testimony." He said, "That's it?" I replied, "Yep, that's it. I'll tell you exactly what to write down, then you just need to memorize it." He agreed and we parted ways. I next needed to dig up dirt on Kevin. I paid the same private detective another $50,000 to see what he could find out. I gave it a couple weeks and the private detective said the only thing he found was that a female co-worker named Sarah complained about her perceived advances he made towards her. I thought to myself, perfect. Now I need to pay her to make up a story that her and Kevin were having an affair. I reached out to my client's family and they were more than willing to give me more money to pay Sarah since I got George to agree to testify against his own brother. I waited for Sarah outside of her work and gave her $50,000 in cash just to listen to me. I lied to her and told her that her old co-worker, Kevin, killed his own family and I needed her to say that she was having an affair with Kevin. I told her I had a statement from Kevin's brother George that he was responsible for the murders. After explaining the situation, she seemed like she didn't feel comfortable. But once I told her that she would get $1 million in cash, then she seemed willing to testify. I paid $300,000 to a lab technician for a vial of Kevin's blood that was being stored in the hospital. I needed to pay this old dirty cop that the drug cartel found me to plant Kevin's blood throughout Richard's house, which cost another $300,000. Then I needed to pay $1 million to a blood analysis expert who would testify that it was Kevin's blood in Richard's house. Because Kevin was trying to plant the murder weapon in Richard's house after Kevin shot himself. Also, I needed a medical expert's testimony that Kevin was strong enough to plant the gun in Richard's house after being shot, which cost me another $600,000. One of the last things I needed to do was hire a ballistics expert to testify that Kevin shot his family and his own wounds were self-inflicted. This cost $500,000. I finalized the court documents for the appeal and with the new evidence presented, the court agreed that an appeal testimony would occur with the hope of a reversal. Tensions were high during the first day of the court proceedings. I basically created a whole new cast of characters from the original court proceedings. Everything was going according to plan. The prosecutors were baffled by George and Sarah's claims. The prosecutors couldn't come up with any type dirt or motive on either of them. They were basically stunned that this information was not discovered during the original trial. Sarah's statement, "Kevin told me that he wanted a new family with me and he wanted to move on from his old family," the judge found extremely damaging towards Kevin. The real game changer came during George's testimony when he said, "Kevin met with me 2 days prior to the murders and he told me his plan on how he was going to murder his cheating wife and was going to frame Richard for the crime." The ballistics expert, the medical expert and the blood analysis expert did what they needed to do. My whole case was completely made up. Nothing was true from the witnesses to the experts. The prosecutors and the judge were baffled by all of the new evidence. I over the prosecutor say to his assistant, "How did we miss Kevin's blood in Richard's house?" The judge and the prosecutors were all part of the original court proceedings and I literally seen them scratching their heads with all of the new evidence presented. It really made the prosecutors look incompetent that they weren't able to find Kevin's blood in Richard's house and the litany of all of the other newly found evidence and testimony. The judge had no choice but to overturn the original conviction. I essentially got paid $5 million in cash for getting a cold-blooded murderer off of death row and out of prison. I was diagnosed as an extreme narcissist years prior, and true to my form, I left my family and started a new life in the Cayman Islands. They tried to prosecute Kevin for the murders, but there were too many holes discovered in the defense that I had given, which didn't matter to me because Richard remained out of prison. Everything was going well until I received 2 unwanted visitors at my Cayman Island beach house. It was Kevin and George, who essentially had kidnapped me at gunpoint. George had told Kevin everything out of guilt, and to make things right they both forced me to transfer all of the money I had in my account over to Kevin's account. The two of them stayed out my house for 2 weeks to ensure the transferred money would stay in their account. After the 2 weeks, they left and now I'm completely broke. I had to sell my house for nothing and now I'm giving bus tours of the island and I'm living essentially in a shack. End of story. That is all for today. If you want to support my automated channel, feel free to drop a like and subscribe. See you tomorrow.